You're watching News at Prime. Let's get into another important discussion now. South Africa trying to garner support from the United States President Joe Biden's administration to renew the country's participation in the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, as it is known. It gives certain African countries duty-free access to the United States. Some Republicans, though, have been calling for South Africa's participation to be reviewed over the country's genocidal intent case against Israel at the World Court. This is over its war on Gaza. So let's speak to one of the participants at that meeting, and Aspen Pharmacare Head of Strategy and Trade is Dr Stavros Nicolaou, who joins us now. Dr. Nicolaou, you insisted I shouldn't call you doctor, but it is your title. I'm going to use it. Good evening to you, and thank you very much for joining us here. Let's start with the business case that you went to the US with, and what was the response?
Firstly, good evening, and thanks very much, Carly, for having me. Firstly, may I say that this relationship, bilaterally and multilaterally through AGOA, is a very important relationship for our country. The United States is one of our largest trading partners and also one of our largest investors. So an exceedingly important relationship, and one that we need to preserve and grow. So that was the main objective of this visit, was to a degree to recalibrate the business relationship. AGOA remains core and fundamental to that. Most viewers will recognize that AGOA is this edition of AGOA that we presently seized with will come to an end in about 16 months. So there's a need to reauthorize this into the next edition, and to do so with speed and swiftness. And I think South Africa, ably led by Minister Parks Tau and Deputy Minister Andrew Whitfield, I think put a compelling case to the Americans. The case was built around the mutual and bilateral benefit that we would both partners would extract from such a relationship. Africa presents a tremendous opportunity for American firms, and similarly preferential access for certain South African sectors into the American economy is also important. So that's what anchored the business case, is the bilateral economic and trade fundamentals, and very well received. I thought the tone of the meetings was good, but most importantly, and in conclusion, the administration, in none other than the form of Secretary Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, and then a number of congressmen and senators across bipartisan lines, were calling for the renewal, the reauthorization, and it was quite a strong signal, I think, that was being sent by both Congress and the administration around the potential to reauthorize for the next term.
Yeah. We know that the United States is going into an election this year. There could be the prospect of former President Donald Trump becoming president again. Is there worry that if perhaps it is an administration led by him or led under his administration, this could put South Africa in a different footing altogether, as opposed to the warm reception that you talk about?
Look, I think it's important to note that the consultations, meetings, and also the representations that were made in a number of fora, the primary one being the AGOA Forum, of course, which is represented by the African trade ministers. All of those engagements were held with a very much a bipartisan representation on the US side. So we were speaking to both Democrats and Republicans. Of course, regardless of who becomes the next president of the United States, and we somewhat 6 or 7 months away from the inauguration of the next president. Presumably it will be in January of 2025. Regardless of who it might be, there is still a Congress that is bipartisan in nature. And that's why it was important to speak to congressmen and women across across both divides, and to make a compelling case. So I'm not saying that we have de-risked, and the fat lady, the proverbial fat lady, still has to sing at the end of all of this. But I think, you can only manage what you can control, and all we had in front of us on this particular visit was a range of congressmen and women, senators, counterparts from business, and then of course the administration that we could speak to. And I think the delegation, again led by Minister Tau, I think put across a balanced and measured, and I thought a compelling case for why one would seek a reauthorization.
Yeah. Let's talk about what happened in May, and it was at the House of Representatives. They passed the US-South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act. So essentially this was a piece of legislation. Of course, it's not passed yet, it's not law, but I guess it's a bill in our terms. This essentially would force the Biden administration to conduct a full review of South Africa's relationship with the United States. And as I repeat, this obviously would need to pass through the Senate before it then is taken to the president for him to sign it into law. Did that piece, did that proposed piece of legislation, was that discussed at all?
Look, I think it came into the equation. It certainly wasn't the dominant discussion, but I mean, it is obviously of some interest and some concern. I never got a sense in any of these consultations that the relationship had deteriorated to an extent where it would turn into a hostile relationship. And I think we also got a sense, certainly that some of the meetings I was present in, my colleagues from business, I think, can confirm this. I don't think the United States and its administration are trying to force down a policy conduct down our throats. I think the problem historically over the past few months and years lies more in the way we've been communicating some of these postures and positions, rather than the postures and positions that you actually take. I think in certain instances, you perhaps need to message things a little differently. But I never got a sense, and I don't think our government would necessarily accede to losing its sovereignty. And I don't think that's what the United States is asking us to do.
Yeah.
I think what we have to do here is we've got a long-standing and successful partnership with the United States. AGOA is one of the key instruments to that. We need to continue building on that, and I think we need to be more, perhaps we need to explain our positions a little better and where we're coming from. Many countries around the world do this balancing act, and I've always said, as a business person, our interests lie in the West, they lie in the East, and they lie in the South, and we can't pick any one of those. We have to look at where our best interest lies as a country, economically and otherwise, and we've got to engage with all of these. Admittedly, it's a balancing act, but the balancing act can be achieved, and other countries like India have shown that. So we need to follow suit, but I never got an impression that the relationship had deteriorated to such an extent that it's, all out hostility. I don't think that's the case at all. We certainly have our work cut out, there's no doubt. But we should be doing that work anyway as a country, because the United States is one of our most important economic, trade and investment partners. Yeah. So we should be investing that time anyway, which is, I think, what we want to do now. That was certainly the tone that Minister Tau struck in the consultations.
You're watching News at Prime. If you're just joining us, we are wrapping up a discussion with Aspen Pharmacare Head of Strategy and Trade, Dr. Stavros Nicolaou, who was part of the delegation to the United States to make a case for South Africa as it regards the AGOA. All right, Dr. Nicolaou, let's pick up on the GNU. I thought I read into your tone of voice in that article that the GNU seemed to excite the Americans to a point where this was almost a done deal. Explain that. I'm paraphrasing it, of course, but explain why it is that Americans are excited by the government of national unity.
You know, a good starting point is we perhaps don't give our country sufficient credit, or I don't know, maybe we do.
Yeah.
There's actually quite a keen interest on South Africa and our politics domestically here. I mean, remember being in Paris a month ago, and David Cameron, the former Secretary of State, Secretary of Foreign Affairs of the UK, was having a conversation with me, and he was very well informed about our domestic politics. So I think that's the starting point. Is there is quite a keen interest, because I think people recognize that if South Africa fails, it has a huge impact on the African continent. And let me paraphrase Anthony Blinken. He said, if Africa succeeds, then the United States succeeds. So I think we should probably give ourselves a little more credit than we probably do for the interest that we enjoy in public political affairs. Now, having said that, at the onset of our discussions, there was great interest and excitement on the GNU concept, and even some anecdotes passed that they being our American counterparts, would do well for us to share some of these experiences and how we got to a GNU in such a short space of time. So those were all positive sentiments expressed, and those positive sentiments fed into the broader AGOA conversations that we had.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt that sentimentally and otherwise, the GNU, which is seen as a unifying force of good in the country, I think that has been well received by the politicians, the business people, and assumedly that will also be the markets futuristically if we are to gauge the sentiment that we got out of the United States.
Very interesting indeed, because in contrast, you would swear that these two countries did not frown upon each other when the Russia-Ukraine conflict became a very hot topic. And then on the back of that, there was that ship that was assumed to have been carrying weapons headed for Russia, weapons procured here in South Africa. At least that was the allegation until it was investigated and it was dismissed. And then you have the Middle East conflict. And I'm saying this, I want to also preface it with some of the commentary of the minister when he addressed the gathering there. I want to quote him directly, because this is what Minister Tau is said to have said in that gathering. We urge the United States administration to refrain from using non-trade consideration in determining AGOA eligibility criteria, and to ensure the developmental dimension of the AGOA program. I'm going to leave that quote there. Yes, I take to heart, Dr. Nicolaou, what you have said earlier, that the reception was quite warm. To use the word hostile, that would not even begin to describe what warm reception you received. However, is there still this undercurrent between the United States and South Africa that the two look at each other in suspicious ways?
Look, there's no doubt that there's a lot of work to be done between now and whenever the reauthorization takes place, and there's speculation as to the timing, but certainly in the forum, a number of the African trade ministers pressed the question to congressmen and women as to the timing, and of course there was a significant focus on an expeditious conclusion so that you can give investors and others certainty and predictability. The best we got out of the counterpart responses was that they understand the need for an expeditious review, for the reauthorization to take place sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
But none of them committed to a date, so we don't know what that date is going to be. So between now and whatever that date might look like futuristically, we need to keep explaining our position. For me, that was the single biggest learning coming out of this trip. And of course, I wear very much a business hat, and our role as business was to support, aid, and abet the positioning and the posture of the business relationship. But I think the biggest lesson for me is we would do well to invest resources in explaining our various positions on both sides, incidentally.
Yeah.
And I can't help but think that some of the tension that arose some months ago could probably have been mitigated, softened, and or avoided even, had there been better communication on both sides, I suspect. So that's really, for me, the biggest lesson coming out of this is we need to invest further in accurate and precise communication, and that applies on both sides, incidentally, so that no confusion, no missteps creep into the conversations.
Final question. Where does trade between South Africa and the AGOA program stand? I read some figures, but I'd like for you to confirm it for the record, just how much South Africa benefits from the AGOA program.
So AGOA, the main benefits of AGOA are that there's either a tariff reduction or a zeroing down of tariffs. I mean, that's the main benefit, to give African companies an opportunity to access the market. So that portion that deals with tariff reduction, if I can loosely call it that, South Africa, from an export perspective, is the biggest beneficiary of that. So we are the largest exporters under AGOA to the United States of non-oil and non-petroleum products. The sectors that benefit the most are the automotive sector, agribusiness, agriculture, wines are quite big in that. So this has given us some form of preferential access through tariff reductions. The magnitude of that is around $3 billion. So if I take our total exports to the United States, those that are under AGOA consideration represent about 1/5. So it is quite sizable from that perspective. It's not catastrophic, for example, if you don't get the reauthorization from a numbers perspective, but it's catastrophic in many other ways, such as what does this do for investor confidence? What does it do for brand reputation globally? So those are the things that we are also seized with. There's a numbers picture here, but there's also a sentiment and confidence issue as well. And almost the latter is more important than the former here.
Dr. Stavros Nicolaou, thank you very much for your time and really taking us into the room where these discussions took place. Aspen Pharmacare Head of Strategy and Trade, telling us about their trip to the United States recently.